So late in the afternoon on the first day of a conference, generally speaking, although all the others have been quite good so far, you need to sort of provoke and possibly re-energize, and that's one of my goals in this talk. Multi-plurinational federation. Canada is a multi-plurinational federation. That's the vision of political scientists, historians, political philosophers, but outside of Quebec, that certainly is not the main vision of the citizenry in Canada, and it is in no way whatsoever a legal constitutional definition of the country. It is possibly something that may be achieved. It is possibly something that has indirect, empirical reality in a number of ways in which we're doing things, obliquely, empirical asymmetries, and so on. But in terms of legal formalism, it's not a correct definition of the country. So what I intend to do this afternoon in terms of the structure of the presentation, so I wish to use the anniversary of a constitutional agreement, which became a constitutional disagreement in the history of Canada, which is called the Meech Lake Accord, which was an agreement between the federal government, the government of Quebec, and the government of all the other provinces to, quote unquote, bring back Quebec with honor and enthusiasm in the Canadian constitutional family in 1987. And that agreement with various histories lasted 3 years and then turned into a major constitutional disagreement that had all kinds of consequences. So one part of my presentation will be that Meech Lake Accord of 25 years ago this year. In the second part of my presentation, I will look at current political and discursive interventions by the current Quebec government in Quebec, the government of the Liberals, with Philippe Couillard as a premier and Jean-Marc Fournier as his Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. And we'll look at the sort of vision of Canadian federalism that they are formulating in the past 18 or 20 months. So I will look at that vision of federalism, how it's formulated. I will compare it in a number of ways with what was the content of the Meech Lake Accord 25 years ago. Then, in the third part, I will look at our current federal campaign, as François Vaillancourt and Keith Banting have alluded this morning, and Laurie Torlakson as well. We're having a federal campaign. The election will be decided on October 19. And the three major parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the New Democrats, have platforms. And in these platforms, they have visions of the political community, visions of federalism, and ways to understand how we should manage intergovernmental relations in the future. And I will bring that into the equation. And I'll try to be as intelligent and clever as I can in my conclusion. But before I do that, let me start with a number of introductory remarks. Let me start with Keith Banting's point this morning, which could say, let's say you're in Keith's class or in my class, and you're asked about Canada as a decentralized or centralized polity, asking what is the good answer. Well, for a moment, let's imagine you're in my class. And let's suppose that you give Keith Banting's answer, which is that Canada is a very decentralized country. And I'll give you your mark in a couple of minutes. But before I do that, let me bring in the insights of one of Keith's former colleagues at Queen's University, the late Richard Simeon, born in England in 1940 and deceased in 2013, and a good friend of ours, in a major paper entitled Federalism and Decentralization, which anybody can find right now on the website of the Bibliography on Federalism of the Form of Federations. Richard answers that question for himself and many others. And like Keith, Richard argues that Canada is a very decentralized federation. He gives many reasons for that, but it can be summarized in the following argument. Why can we say that the Canadian Federation is decentralized? And Richard's famous argument is, it is because that provinces have a number of capacities. Which sorts of capacities do Canadian provinces have, albeit asymmetrically? They have political capacities. They're seen as relevant by citizens in their respective provinces. They have jurisdictional capacities. They have powers entrenched in the Constitution that cannot be taken away by a government when the leaders of that province go to sleep at night. These provinces have fiscal capacities, and there's been a lot about that today. And in the end, they also have bureaucratic capacities. They have the backbone to deal with each other and to deal with the central government. So let this be my contribution to the argument that yes, indeed, it is at least a partially good answer to say that Canada is a very decentralized federation. One could, with time, question whether or not bureaucratic capacity, jurisdictional capacities, and aren't these things very asymmetrically distributed? Are not some provinces, for instance, sort of bureaucratic colonies of central government? Let's forget about these nuances. Let's accept it that on a number of criteria, indeed, with good reason, it is fully correct to say that Canada is a very decentralized federation. In my class, you get 100% if you say that simultaneously Canada is a very decentralized polity, but also at the same time a very centralized one. It's both. And this is what makes it so, I think, very interesting for the public at large, for lay scholars, for experts on federalism. It is that complex dimension that makes the study of Canada so fascinating. To get at my second part, I need to accelerate the rhythm a little bit. So I'll go brutally to the parts in which I believe, indeed, it is very centralized. It's very centralized in terms of coordination, management of intergovernmental relations for a variety of historical reasons that are linked to the structure of the British state, and in particular at the structure of the British Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, because that's where it comes from. Canada's system of vertical management of intergovernmental relations comes from that. So Canada is very centralized in terms of intergovernmental relations. It's also very centralized with regards to the structure of the judiciary branch of government. It became, in a way, even an additional layer of centralization was added by the content of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and its nationalizing or centralizing effects on legal interpretation and on political culture in 1982. And I think there are other dimensions that should be mentioned. So I start with a dialogue with Simeon, and I say that it's both centralized and decentralized. Let me move to some other of my introductory remarks. I borrow from Michael Keating's contributions to political science, a number of concepts. The idea that late in the 20th century, it started before, but late in the 20th century, it became possible to see complex polities like the UK or like Canada, complex polities where it is fully possible, at least in theory, to imagine the cohabitation of more than one national project. An ability for a society linked to a government to develop forms of self-government, forms of agency in economic, cultural, social, and political dimensions of life, to be a full partner within that country or at the international level. So the three concepts that can be borrowed from Keating are the idea of a national project, post-sovereignty, and of course, plurinational democracy. So the idea is, in a way, in a substantially centralized and decentralized country such as Canada, are we doing with regards to the co-presence of two national projects? Well, depending on whether you believe that the glass is half full or half empty, your perspective may vary. And frankly, I turned 60 this year, and on many of these issues, I have more doubts now than I had 30 years ago, and much fewer certainties. But let me use, again, something that was mentioned by Keith as a way to move into the second part of my presentation. Keith said, well, with regards to the indirect, oblique, empirical acceptation of asymmetry. In other writings, I call that indirect English or British asymmetry. With regards to that, in Canada, we're doing reasonably okay. But please don't ask us to formalize that, to transform that into a principle of some kind of formal recognition of asymmetry. Don't ask us that. Well, of course, prior to Meech Lake in the late 1980s, after Meech Lake, and in the past 2 years in the pronouncements of the Quebec government, among other things, this is precisely what Quebec asks to other provinces, to Canadian citizens, and to the Canadian federal government, to find a way to constitutionally recognize this huge fact that no one denies, that Quebec, as a majority French-speaking society in the Americas, contributing in a wide variety of ways to the originality of the Canadian national project vis-à-vis the American project in the United States. Let me pause on this for 1 second. Bilingualism, two systems of law, French civil law, the English common law, two networks of civil society associations, two networks of scientific organizations, two communities with remarkable cultural creativity. Those are all ways in which Quebec contributes massively. Not the only way, not the only cause of this, but it contributes massively to the originality of the Canadian national project north of the United States. But at the same time, Quebec, particularly since the Quiet Revolution in 1960, has developed its own national project, its own desire to act, to have agency in economic, cultural, social, political dimensions. In theory, fully compatible with the Canadian national project. But in practice, coming with a number of difficulties, including the one alluded to by Keith this morning. So there's this difficulty of, let's say, Canadian central government, Canadian provinces, Canadian citizens to formally recognize asymmetry. So that's, let's call this the Canadian problem. For getting into Meech Lake, let me move to the other side, the Quebec problem. What's the Quebec problem within Canada? Let me try to summarize this for you. Well, I'll start by quoting from a Toronto journalist, Globe and Mail journalist, who's had 40 years of relationships with Quebec, love, hate, sympathy, contempt, from all the range of emotions. In one of his pessimistic moments, Jeffrey Simpson summarized it with the following expression that English Canadians have asked very often. Well, this new Quebec, this Quebec that has developed its national project, what does it want? And Simpson's answer is it simply wants more. More money, more autonomy, more recognition, more power. Now, in return, the representatives of this Quebec national project, what are they ready to give? What are they ready to contribute to the greater whole of the Canadian national project north of the United States? And on that day, Simpson summarized his thought by saying, well, Quebec is ready to give nothing. So there's this vision, very entrenched, both right-wing and left-wing in the Canadian political, mediatic, intellectual community, that Quebec actually wants a lot, but is not prepared to share. It wants full autonomy, but very little on the side of interdependence. So that's the Quebec problem. So for Canada as a multinational federation, with devolution, with symbolic and substantive asymmetry to work, in the future, one would have to address simultaneously what I've called the Canadian problem and the Quebec problem. So let me move to Meech Lake with this. How much time have I used?
You're okay. You've got still got 10 minutes.
I still have 10.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. In 1980, so Meech Lake was the Canadian way, or part of the Canadian way of changing constitutions. We're like the UK. We like reformism. So we're not like the French. We don't throw the house down and rebuild a new one. We just add a layer. We add another part, another block. So the basement for us is what we share with you, the British heritage. And then the first floor is our federal constitution, 1867. And then the second floor is the 1982 Constitution, Charter of Rights and Liberties, and some other things. And in the mid-80s, and the latter one, 1982, was adopted without the consent of the government or National Assembly of Quebec. So in the mid-80s, an attempt was made to add another floor to the Canadian Constitutional House, and this would have been the Meech Lake Accord. It has many origins, but for today, I'll content myself with one. A colleague of Keith Banting and Richard Simeon at Queen's, the late Peter Leslie, was very instrumental in organizing a conference held at Mont Gabriel, nice hotel in Quebec. This was May 11, 1986. It was after the election of a federalist government in Quebec, federalist government very sympathetic to a federalist government in Ottawa led by the Conservatives of Brian Mulroney. At that conference, the minister responsible for Quebec enumerated the 5 conditions that Quebec would require in order to be a full member of the Canadian constitutional family. I have those 5 here. You can read by yourselves. The most contentious, or on the symbolic side of things, was, of course, the explicit recognition of Quebec as a distinct society. Considering the time limits, I just want you to look at this list. And if I'm good enough, you'll see it reappear 2 other times. So those were sort of late 20th century, 1986. That's what the Quebec government wanted, 5 things. So then, the Meech Lake Accord, in various formulations between 1987 and 1990, more or less after complex, behind-the-door negotiations, the last gasp of the pre-participatory constitutional political culture in Canada, came up with a deal that was very much close to the demands, what Quebec needs in Canadian Constitution. If I'm correct, one of the problems of the Meech Lake Accord, not the only one, there were many problems, but one of the problems was what I have identified here today as the Quebec problem. And Bourassa, the leader of Quebec at the time, had this vision that he called useful or instrumental federalism, utilitarian federalism, to speak like the age of the Scottish Enlightenment. This is what's good for us. Okay? Quebec didn't say much what it offered to others. That was one of the problems with the Meech Lake Accord. Meech Lake had all kinds of parallel dimensions. It would have transformed the way we manage intergovernmental relations. It would have regularized, brought a principle of rationality into the management of intergovernmental relations. And its failure kept us into what I've called the quasi-imperial traditional way of doing intergovernmental affairs. Let me move more rapidly. So fast forward 25 years, I've still got 5 minutes, something like that. Fast forward 25 years, and of course, many things have changed in Canada and in Quebec since then. I mentioned one point, transformation of the political culture of constitutionalism. Pre-1987, premiers and the Canadian Prime Minister can get behind closed doors, make a deal, not really prepare the public, not consult much outside executive branches of government, and that was our way of doing these things. Of course, it's one of the things that have changed. Many other things have changed. Aboriginal peoples in the process of constitutional dialogue is much more important. The demographical landscape of the country has changed with greater economic and demographical power out west in Alberta and British Columbia, among other things. So many things have changed. Some of the things that haven't changed, if I'm correct, illustrated by what the new Quebec government has brought together starting in 2014, is the sort of lists of things that Quebec wants from a constitutional reform. In the speeches made by Fournier in October 2014 at a conference I co-organized with Eugénie Bouillet, in a major speech he delivered in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario on May 11, 2015, and in a recent letter he wrote to leaders of federal parties in the Canadian election, the Premier of Quebec, Philippe Couillard, repeated a list of elements. We need a constitutional recognition of Quebec's distinctiveness. We need the enshrinement of the 1991 deal on immigration. We need the federalizations of institutions such as the Supreme Court and the Senate. We need a new way to manage intergovernmental relations, in part to discuss some of the issues that have been mentioned here by Banting and Vaillancourt, the major issues of health transfers and equalization. So those are the things that Quebec wants, and they are remarkably similar to what had been expressed in the Meech Lake Accord in the late 1980s, 25 years ago. Negotiating constitutions in a multinational federation is a remarkably complex affair. Many people have gotten wrinkles, white hair, big glasses, and all kinds of other things. So there are generations of political scientists, constitutional lawyers in Canada that know this very well. It doesn't get easy when you have not only 2 or 10, not 14, but maybe more than 500 partners around the table if you include the Aboriginal nations, and many more citizens groups who feel that they've been empowered in part by the Canadian Charter of Rights of 1982. So extremely difficult to envision that. Conclusion in that context. Constitutional reform is an unlikely priority in Canada. An area where real progress would be helpful would be the management of intergovernmental relations. Can we learn from you? I thought yes, but many of you have not convinced me, but suggested otherwise. What I like anyway is at least in things like post-1998 devolution and Good Friday Agreement, there's some kind of rationality in North-South Ministerial Council in Ireland, in British-Irish Council, British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, even Memorandum of Understanding. At least there's a basis of rationality in the way you do it, although your state is very centralized. In our case, there's no basis of rationality. There's the total arbitrary capacity of the central government to do what it wants. If it wants to bring in provinces to discuss with them health transfers or equalization, it can. But if it doesn't want, it has no obligation whatsoever. So what is striking in the federal campaign is that the Quebec Premier has written to his counterparts, the leaders of the federal parties. He's repeated the traditional Quebec demands, modernized for the 21st century. Some of them have responded, including Justin Trudeau, the new leader of the Liberal Party. Others will. What has changed, I think, in 25 years, what did not exist 25 years ago, is that there was not in Quebec a leadership that was prepared to express the interests of the Quebec National Project, while as well expressing something beyond instrumentalism and utilitarian understanding of Quebec's role in Canada. This has changed. If I read properly what is coming out of the new Quebec authorities, they're propounding a vision of federalism that is, of course, based on the Quebec National Project, but with a much more refined and generous understanding of the Canadian National Project that was proposed by Quebec leaders 25 years ago. And in 2017, with the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Canadian Federation, possibly our leaders, however complex our amending formula may be, may have an opportunity to renew the kind of constitutional generosity that we haven't had for a long time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Keir. Now call Michael up to the
Right, I'm going to speak on much the same lines that Guy did, giving some kind of interpretive, consensual interpretation of constitutionalism in the UK and in Canada, which gives me an excuse for not having a conclusion. So I'm talking about constitutional conundrums rather than a constitutional roadmap. And I want to point out some differences between the two cases, but some fundamental similarities in the position they've got to at the moment and why some constitutional issues seem to be intractable, can be managed for a short time, but will continue to reverberate because they become part of the mainstream of politics. And I want to start off with two conceptual dimensions. One is about the nature of the polity, and the second is about the nature of the Constitution. Now, there's a familiar distinction in the literature between mono-national states and multinational states, where there is one nation or where there are multiple nations. My interpretation of what a nation is very much a constructivist one. I don't think they exist as a concrete reality. It's a set of relationships. It's something that is continually built and rebuilt. It's not purely subjective. It's not purely objective. It's intersubjective, which is why I rather prefer the concept of political community, which is continually changing. And what we're seeing in Canada and the UK is the reconstruction of political community. Now, after this morning's session, Alan came up to me and said, "You've been talking about constitutional politics and you never talked about identity at all." So Alan, I will talk a little bit about identity now. What we're talking about is sometimes subsumed under the heading of identity politics. And I will accept that on condition that we also recognize that identities are constantly constructed and reconstructed with their own narrative. There's nothing objective, rooted in ethnic belonging, let alone biology, about identities. And identities are something that is really very difficult to pin down. And what is vitally important in the case of the UK and Canada is you mustn't associate identity with values or believing certain sorts of things, because in both cases, we're getting a convergence of values and a divergence of political projects. Stéphane Dion, who's mentioned this morning, wrote an article about 20 years ago. It's very interesting. It was about the political divergence in amongst cultural convergence. He called it de Tocqueville's paradox. That it's not that they believe radically different things. People believe the same kind of things. They share the same fundamental values. But they have a different framework for expressing those, because political communities are being rebuilt. And I will argue that such kinds of national projects are in some ways more difficult to reconcile than traditional ethnic politics, because they're claiming exactly the same normative space. They're proposing to do exactly the same thing, but just in a different framework. And then I introduced the notion of plurinational states. Now, that was partly a translation from Spanish, where they talk about plurinacional, but it was also something more substantive. When I introduced this into the English language, I was making the point that it's not you have multiple nations. Here's Scotland, here's England, here's Quebec. But these are all interlinked and interconnected in very, very complicated ways. The ontology of the nation is by no means clear. And that within Scotland, of course, we know very well, some people think they're only Scots, a few people think they're only British. Most people mix up these identities in different ways, depending on the context. And within both Canada and the United Kingdom, we've got an asymmetry of identities in that people in English Canada, we call it that for shorthand, but Canada outside Quebec, tend to think they have a single national identity. It's Canada. Quebec should be part of it, but not as a separate thing, but as part of this Canadian thing. Whereas people in Quebec are much more familiar with the notion of having two identities. And similarly, people in England for a long time have tended to use England and Britain and the UK interchangeably. They're learning better nowadays, but there was this tendency, whereas people in Scotland are quite familiar with the difference between the two. So this makes it very difficult to have a single notion, even what the nation means. So the very conception of nation is pluralist. Not just there are different nations, but the way that the nation is constructed and felt is very, very different. So that's one conceptual axis about the nature of political community. And the other is about the nature of the state. Now, we can leave aside unitary states, because neither of us have a unitary state. But in discussions of federalism, and in the UK, let's say we have a kind of federalism here. It's part of the broad family of federalism. We could use federalism as the framework for looking at both Canada and the United Kingdom. There is a long distinction between symmetrical and asymmetrical federations, and a long tradition going from John Stuart Mill through a famous article by Tarleton in the 1950s, arguing that you can only have federalism in mononational states, but you require a single demos to make the federal level work, a single political community, and that if you empower constituent parts, we might call them nations or political communities, this will be destabilizing to the polity. So the very fact that a state is plurinational, according to this argument, is a good reason for not federalizing it. And that indeed was the predominant position of unionism in the United Kingdom from the late 19th century, when this issue became salient in relation to Ireland and then in relation to Scotland, right up till the end of the 20th century. It informs the work of Dicey, it informs the work of Wilson, who did a famous memorandum of dissent to the Kilbrandon report. He keeps on coming up again, precisely because we know you're a nation. That's why we can't let political identities and power cross, because the polity would completely disintegrate. Now, the literature on federalism no longer really has that as a mainstream element, because there's another set of works on federalism talking about multinational and plurinational federalism. Federalism may be a way precisely to accommodate these differences. But these are two quite different conceptions of federalism, quite different ways of thinking how federalism operates. Now, when it comes to asymmetry and devolution, again, there are two dimensions here that are both very important. One is the substantive dimension, that is, what powers are you going to devolve? And the other is the symbolic, or the element of recognition. And hence Guy's paradox, that you have a Canadian federation that devolves a lot of substantive policy powers, but on the other hand, has failed on the symbolic recognition. The United Kingdom traditionally does it the other way around. We have lots of symbolic recognition, so we don't care whether anybody calls them a nation or not. I mean, it just doesn't really matter. We have all kinds of symbolic things. Like when I go to Spain, I was just there a few days ago, and people ask me the usual question, how come you have your own football team? Catalonia, they said they'd love to have their own football team in Catalonia, as long as they could continue to play in the Spanish team as well. But how come you've got your own football team, and you don't have a British team? And I said, and what constitutional provision allows you to do that? What is the law? I say, this is to do with railway timetables in the 19th century. The trains didn't go north-south. You had a league in Scotland and then a national team and so on. But it's become, of course, an important element of national identity. So many of these things are in civil society, but some of them are in politics as well. And the other thing my Spanish colleagues love is the way the royal family changes its religion when they cross the border and they become Calvinists and start believing in predestination. And when they're in England, they believe in other kinds of things. So unionism in Britain has been really brilliant at constructing the nation in symbolic ways in a very sophisticated and differentiated way, projecting itself, even projecting the monarchy differently in different parts of the United Kingdom. But it's been absolutely terrible on constitutional reform, because if you look at the constitutional reform agenda in the 1910 and the constitutional reform agenda in 1990, it was exactly the same. And the House of Lords, the devolution, the structure of the state, centralization, and so on. And so only at the end of the 20th century, then things started moving very, very quickly, and we had an awful lot of constitutional reform. So there are two different stories to be told here, but they're ways of dealing with similar problems. Now, if we go more deeply and ask, well, what is it about these symbolic debates? Because it's very easy to say symbols are just symbols. But of course, symbols symbolize something. That's why they're really important and why people argue about them. Very often it's about defining the political community. It's about the past, it's about the present, it's about the future. Defining the political community or the demos underlying democracy. What is the relevant community of belonging? Demos for democracy now, as I'll argue in a moment, it's got a lot to do with welfare as well. It's latched on to that. Picking on some of the things that were being said this morning. There's a shared telos, that is, we know where we're going, we know what the future is constitutionally. We're just trying to get onto a shared path to a future that we agree upon. And equally important, there's a shared past. Now, the past, of course, is not fixed. The past is continually being reinvented. And you're continually getting arguments about the past. And that's in many, many countries. Arguments about politics are arguments about the past. Now, some of my fellow political scientists talk about past dependency. They've just discovered history. And they say, the past determines the future. And I say, no, congratulations on learning about history, but you got it the wrong way around. It's the present that determines the past. The agenda of history is determined on what matters at the moment. So we've got our national stories. And in Canada, we have this argument about the origins of the polity, the two nations vision, which is a Quebec vision. Two nations, a partnership, versus the other Canadian vision. No, it's a single nation. And go back. And it's no good arguing about what these guys were saying in Charlottetown in 1865 or whatever it was. That's not the point. It's the way it was understood historically. Historical understandings change. Now, we in the United Kingdom don't argue a great deal about those kinds of things. In fact, one thing that strikes me about people in England is they hardly have any historical curiosity at all. Ireland, you go there and the history is coming out. Scotland somewhere, Scotland somewhere in between. These stories about the past are absolutely vital because they're stories about the foundations of political authority. Much more political authority than we like to concede is rooted in history. So these arguments about the past become very important, and they're about sovereignty. In the UK, we never try to resolve these things. This was a very clever thing to do. In Canada, they agonize constantly. They want to run, and in Spain, too, where I was the other day, they're trying to get an agreed account of Spanish history and everything. It's absolutely futile. And I think the traditional British position was probably quite healthy. Don't ask, don't tell. Where does sovereignty come from? We even have two doctrines of sovereignty in Scotland and the Westminster Doctrine. The late Neil McCormack wrote a great deal about this, saying, well, I believe in one, but he had the generosity of spirit to say, well, there is another one, it's plausible. We don't have to agree about these things. So we kept a lot of constitutional indefinition, and that's what kept the Union together, because it wasn't one thing, it was multiple things in different places. And I give an example to illustrate this. What is unionism? Well, go to an Orange March in Ballymena and go to a Conservative garden party in the home counties. That's all unionism. There's almost nothing in common. But they're all forms of being unionist. Now, what happens more recently in the late 20th century is that these sort of things come together, and these stories about political community and nationhood start intersecting with big questions about institutions and political authority because of the transformation of the state, because of the loss of authority in traditional institutions, decline in deference, and changing social relationships. This is one of the things we've been looking at in our centre here with a big banner. One of the things we focus on precisely is the intersection between constitutional debates and constitutional theory and public policy issues, because they come together in both Canada and the UK, as we've seen this morning, in very, very important ways. And so there's been an attempt to reinvent national communities competing with each other in the same kind of territorial space, but also in the same normative space. It occurred to me to illustrate this when I was talking to GIS students a couple of years ago. It suddenly occurred to me we have two emblematic figures here, which are Gordon Brown and Pierre Trudeau. An intellectual from the smaller nation becomes prime minister, has to legitimate himself in a period of constitutional turbulence, constitutional crisis, and needs to invent Canadianness or Britishness. I say invent because there's always been Britishness, but invent it as a strong doctrine. And Gordon Brown's work was quite sophisticated. He is an intellectual. The book he wrote on that is one of the most sophisticated pieces of intellectual discourse. But in the previous version, in Less Cautious People, and this was particularly visible during the New Labour period, there was Britishness that somehow is homogeneous across the United Kingdom. Some people don't understand that Northern Ireland is not British, it's part of the United Kingdom, it's not British. Now, little things like this really matter. There's that, and then beneath that you can have all kinds of diversity. So I read a speech by Jack Straw saying, we're all British, that's the same thing, but you can also hyphenate that with being Scottish or Welsh or Muslim or, so these were all the same thing. And similarly, Trudeau, there's a Canadian identity beneath which there is multiculturalism in Quebec, the same thing. So we will have bilingualism coast to coast, not recognizing that French is the language of a political community, which is Quebec. And this created, in both cases, problems that were really quite unnecessary because they started to essentialize nationalism. Now, this is done by nation-building projects that feel vulnerable. It's not strong nations that do this, it's weak nations like Spain, Canada, and the UK. They feel somehow the identity is under threat, so they feel necessary to reassert it and reinforce it. Now, in the case of the United Kingdom, we've had this recent debate about Britishness. And the new Labour version, thankfully, seems to have gone out of fashion. But, and this is a very serious question, what is the relationship of these political communities' identities to various kinds of social, political rights? And the debate on the unionist side, the argument has been, well, Britishness is necessary for civil rights. They're talking about a British Charter of Rights. It's partly informed by Euroscepticism. And I said, well, just go to Canada, where people in Quebec very often do not accept the Canadian Charter of Rights, not because of what's in it, because their own Charter of Rights is almost identical, but because it was seen as attaching rights to being Canadian. It's a nationalizing project. Similarly, in the UK, it's a nationalizing project. And you go to Northern Ireland and say, look, you've got to sign up to being British before you get your basic rights. It's not going to work. Scotland is not as polarized, but it becomes problematic in Scotland. Or social rights. We have our social rights. This is a very strong theme of Gordon Brown, because he is a social democrat. We have our social rights through being British. If we're in a position where 50% of the population are voting not to be British, what happens to them? Oh, do you not get rights because you're a Scottish nationalist? So this is a nationalising project. Now, there's a Scottish nationalising project as well. These are almost identical rights. Universal health care and all the rest of it. But the question is, whose rights are they? What constitutional project do they latch onto? And this is what I was talking about earlier on when I said it's not about substantive values. And indeed, if you look at the United Kingdom, sometimes I wonder what the problem is, other than something that people are inventing, because the welfare state is not in danger because of shifting identities. The welfare state is certainly not in danger because Scotland is going its own way. There's no evidence. The welfare state is in danger for all kinds of other reasons, but the multinational nature of the state clearly isn't one of them. Basic civil liberties, pluralism, these are not really under challenge anywhere. So the framing of the argument is somehow, if we allow plurinationalism, we'll lose these substantive rights. Seems to me to be profoundly misguided and creating problems where it doesn't exist. Even sharing, even territorial redistribution is widely shared, as Ailsa and her colleagues have shown. People are willing to share as long as you don't nail it down to having to be British and part of a Britishness project. So I see Canada and the UK both being caught up in this conundrum that they feel a need to express the national project and the national identity through strong forms of identity, latching on to rights to social welfare and other things. I really can't see what problem that is addressing, but it's a serious question because we are seeing the clash now of a Scottish national project and a UK national project, finding it increasingly difficult to find common institutional ground, not because there are substantive differences in policy or values, but because these are rival projects. Now, I'll just conclude by saying, once again, this is not the only place in Europe where this is happening. This is all part of the reshaping and the rescaling of political communities. These are really difficult, tricky problems that are facing all advanced societies. But in Scotland, we keep on telling ourselves we have the luxury that in one very small place, we can see this issue through a very powerful lens, and we can see how it is working out in practice.
Okay, wonderful. We've got lots of time for questions. And we've got microphones now in the room, and we've got a hand straight up in the air. And you go.
My first question goes to Professor Guy. You talk about plurinational and accommodation in the context of Canada. It makes me wonder, at least I'm impressed you mentioned that Aboriginals are more important now. Personally, to you as a person, do you think the Aboriginals are deserving of equal dignity as other Canadians? I ask this because I'm a bit, will I say, surprised that most Canadian scholars, when they speak, they talk about a dual national kind of patterns of national movements. And the Aboriginals always come far behind. And of the only four countries that voted against the rights of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Canada was one. So to what extent is there any impact from the works of Professor James Tolley, who talks about strange multiplicity, articulates a new conceptual framework, or is the Canadian project so bonded by this empire vision that renders it almost impossible to see the other as an equal sort of identity? And the second question goes to Professor Michael Keating. You try to water down the definition and significance of nation identity as intersubjective, constructivist, and something that is an ongoing project. Now, in the context of the plurinational, I am wondering how insignificant identity can be in view of the fact that the background to building the political structures we have, which are fallout of the British Empire structure, Canada, the US to an extent, New Zealand, Australia, and much of Africa, including my country, which was once a member of the United Kingdom. Nigeria, you see identity featuring very prominently in shaping the constitutional structures across. At a time, as postulated by James Lorimer, a recognition under international law was based on whether you are categorized as belonging to a civilized nation or a barbarian nation, which were the Ottomans in the Middle East, or savages, who had no right to recognition whatsoever. So if it was so significant in framing international law and the constitutional structures within these parts of the former British Empire that are now independent countries, why should it now be downplayed? And if you were to conceptualize the idea of plurinational a bit outside of this British legacy context, I was wondering whether you've considered the constitutional developments in South America, particularly the Plurinational Republic of Bolivia. If you look at its constitution, its idea of plurinational would appear to be fairly different from the vision you're articulating. And yours may also be different from the way the Spanish scholar, I'm trying to remember his name now, Pau's supervisor.
Reguejo?
Sorry?
Ferran Reguejo.
Yeah, Ferran. Yeah, his visions of the plurinational seem to be a bit different from yours as well. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the construct, the conceptual and philosophical underpinnings of that vision of the plurinational as a state made of many nations, each of which may be as different as anything, but have equal rights, like in Bolivia with 34 official languages. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, JP. Do you want to go first on First Nations?
Thanks for your question. If you ask me what's my official definition of Canada, in my metaphors, Canada, first and foremost, is the product of the encounter of two European imperial projects, British and French, on grounds peopled by the Aboriginal nations and further developed and enriched by wave after wave of immigration. So that's Canada. What makes it different in rapid summarizing of imperial history in the Americas, what makes it different from the Spanish imperial project and British, later US imperial project? Well, in two cases, it ended essentially in massive genocides. And in the case of Canada, they were parked in reservations in the 19th century and placed under the tutelary authority, first of the British Crown and then of the Canadian Crown and the federal government in 1867. And they stayed there essentially for over a century. So the issue of Aboriginal rights, you mentioned James Tully. He was my co-director at McGill. He wrote a book on Locke and property in 1980. Okay? Read the full book again. There's not one footnote about the rights of Aboriginal peoples in the Americas in his chapter on property. Another Tully, 10 years later, had rediscovered Locke the imperialist, justifying the appropriation of the lands of the Aboriginal peoples in the Americas. So, in a way, in Canada, including Quebec, the issue of the dignity of the Aboriginal people and of their rights has resurfaced essentially between 1970 and 1990. They have a foothold in the Constitution of 1982. So it is a very long process. It started in 1982. If the 1982 Constitution, in my understanding, has ignoble dimensions, it has some more noble dimensions, and the recognition of the rights of ancestral peoples and the opening of a process for negotiations of self-government and land claims with them is part of the more positive dimensions of that Constitution. Both levels of government, Canadian, Quebec, and other provinces, have acted on that. The court process has acted on that in a variety of ways. It may take beyond my lifetime and beyond your own lifetime to really entrench politically the rights and the dignity that they have in the Americas, in our country and in all the others.
Yeah, let me straighten out this ontological point about what exists. Just because something is socially constructed does not mean it doesn't exist. On the contrary, these things are very real, sociologically real, not physically real. The nation is a very powerful reality, but we know enough about history to know that they come and go. They change over time. They're built in very, very different ways. And when I was an undergraduate student, the idea was they'll just go away again. And then at the end of the Cold War, Eric Hobsbawm said, with his Marxist kind of teleology, well, they'll go away. That was a phase of history just before they came back again. But it came back in different ways. So these are forms of human collectivity that really matter to people and have consequences and are then institutionalized. As for how they can be accommodated, well, Ferran Rakeku is a very good friend of mine. We have many conversations about this. We're largely in agreement about this for many years. Well, the state is not the answer. You could never get nations and state to fit together perfectly. You've got to rethink this completely. You don't fit in the existing state, so you'll become independent, but you just create as many problems as you've solved because you can never get the line drawn in the right place, which would be my approach. Ferran just gave up because he said Catalonia cannot be recognized by Spain. Spain won't give us an inch, so I'll go for independence. And so I say to Ferran, do you really believe you're as much of a nationalist? He said, no, I'm still a federalist. but if we vote for independence, we'll then negotiate. We'll establish ourselves as a negotiating partner, and then we'll maybe talk to Spain again, which just shows the failure of statecraft in Spain. At the moment, they're heading for a train crash because there's no common ground left. And this seems to me to be quite unnecessary. They didn't need to get there. Nationalists make two claims. One is an ontological claim, we are a nation, and the other follows, we have a right to self-determination. Both of them are negotiable because there's no such thing as a homogeneous nation anywhere. And self-determination doesn't necessarily mean having your own state, because there'd never be enough to go around. So my philosophy is these are always contested fields. There are ways of rethinking institutions to make this work. And although I met Ferran in the square in Barcelona on Friday, where there were 1.5 million people, he was wearing a T-shirt. I wasn't. I was an observer. He was there for Catalan independence. But fundamentally, we don't really disagree because he's not a traditional statist nationalist. He knows that era has long gone past us.
May I add something on that? The idea, the concept of plurinationalism also means, I fully accept the point in terms of historical or social construction and so on, but it's also the idea that these national projects have plurality within. So it's not just that they are parallel nations within a state. They have plurality within. So let's look at Quebec, for instance, for 2 dimensions. So there is, you mentioned it, the fact that the duality, the presence in the minds of probably 60 to 70% of the people, that they have they have an allegiance to both national projects. At times, our obsessed bureaucrats in both Ottawa and Quebec City start to have nervous breakdown because a poll has revealed that that support for the priority of the Canadian national project has been reduced by 3% in Quebec last month, or otherwise seen from the obsessions of the Quebec City bureaucrats. But the fact of the matter is that beyond these obsessions, the 2 national projects with some variations have remained for quite some time present. So, and the second aspect deals with, in the case of the plurality of the Quebec National Project or the Quebec political community, well, Quebec resembles the whole of Canada a lot. If Canada has Aboriginal nations, a territorially concentrated national minority, and waves of immigration, well, possibly one of the only places in the world that resembles this Canada is Quebec, which also has Aboriginal peoples, waves of immigration, and a territorially concentrated national minority, mostly of the English-speaking language. So they resemble each other a lot. The reason why I intervene is that at times, I study Spain and Catalonia a lot. and I can be critical of expressions of both of their national projects, like I am of my own and of the Canadian National Project at home. So, seen from Madrid, there are many things, but let's say one of them. Seen from Madrid, what is going on in the Catalan National Project is that for many people, it's being redefined as we will speak Catalan and English. And Spanish Castilian is essentially a foreign language that has nothing to do with our own national project. Well, I think that's historically wrong, very bad for the future of the of the Catalan National Project, and also very offensive for Madrid, with reason. So how do you move beyond the exclusive definitions of your own national project, reducing its plurality, or sort of instrumentalizing, not recognizing that the other project is also, in many ways, part of yours, is quite certainly a challenge for Spain and Catalonia. It is one for Canada and Quebec. And whether or not it is still relevant here is something that I'll learn more in the next couple of days. Just joking.
Other questions? Yeah.
Jim Gallagher, a challenge for Michael and a question for Guy. The challenge for Michael is you were slightly dismissive of the concept of rights as it were belonging to either a British or a Scottish polity. But the thing about rights is that they also command resources. And in particular, social rights determine the allocation of very substantial amounts of resources, into 5 or 10% of GDP if you're going to guarantee a pension or you're going to guarantee a healthcare. And that might well involve a lot of redistribution. So it's not merely a case of, as it were, vertical fiscal transfers. It might well be horizontal fiscal transfers. And I'm not sure that your dismissal of that recognises what you might call the fiscal element of that argument. And the question for Guy, whose presentation was very illuminating, I must say. You concluded, there was a very nice point which you made critical of the Quebec National Project, which was that it asked for lots but was apparently prepared to give nothing. But then you concluded by talking about constitutional generosity. And I'd be really interested to know what you think constitutional generosity from the Quebec project would be, because there's an analogy here in the Scottish story as well. Because it's quite easy, as Michael did, to say that the UK project, the British project, has to face up to the reality that nearly half of the Scottish voters rejected it. But conversely, the Scottish project has to face up to the reality that over half of the Scottish voters rejected it too. So what does generosity look like from someone who's constantly been a demandeur?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll ask your last question. I'll address that. Yeah, the 50-50 dilemma. And now, if there'd been a 99% vote for independence or the other way around, but when society is divided 50-50, then the majority, the 51 or the 55 or whatever it is, has got to accommodate the other side, as would if they'd gone the other way. There's a moral obligation to be as expansive as possible. And that's why the referendum, the whole referendum notion was so problematic, that one half will impose a solution on the other half. I think it would have worked its way out if it had gone pro-independence, just as it went the other way, and it's being worked out, and the other side is coming some way. There's got to be a compromise. And in Northern Ireland, we've actually learned how to do that. And the settlement is collapsing in Northern Ireland, but what we not over what they thought it would collapse over, which was the teleology of two sides wanting to go to different places. That's not why it collapsed, because the evidence is now that majorities on both sides like that principle of suspending sovereignty, suspending the future, not argument where you're going, and focusing on other issues. On the rights belonging to a polity and the resources, this is really critical, and that's where I started off, and perhaps didn't develop that point sufficiently. But we heard a lot this morning about huge amounts of money following welfare, welfare is attached to some conception of social solidarity. If you're a Scottish nationalist, well, you say, well, the Scottish level is where that will happen. If you're a British nationalist or union, you'd say, well, the British level. Neither of them has any rooting in any universal principle, whatever. They're just different kinds of nationalism. So you can't really resolve that. But then if you go back to the data, you'll see that, in fact, there is more support for sharing than the alarmist would really believe. So it's a bit of a non-problem. And that one of the problems with welfare, and again, it sort of came out this morning, but my argument about welfare is it's increasingly being detached from economic policy. Economic policy goes up to Europe, goes here, and social policy goes somewhere else. And the essence of the welfare state has always been bring those into synchrony and have some kind of social compromise. And we're losing that for all kinds of reasons. I don't think you could restore that just by taking it down to the Scottish level. You just create the same problem at a different level. I'd like to see it happening at European level, but it's not. And it's disintegrating at the British level. And I think that is really very, very problematic. I just think that when you start tying social solidarity to thick senses of national belonging, you're creating unnecessary problems. And it would be better to build in the principle of solidarity at all levels of policy, all the way from the European down to the local. And then you could really say, I'm defending the principle of solidarity rather than any particular national project.
Guy?
Thanks for both the comment and the question. I'll start with two facts concerning recent publications and an invitation. Many of you are students. We're teachers. You have our email addresses. You have the PowerPoints. They can be circulated to the list of participants here, and we can remain in contact. The dialogue can go on beyond this conference. Two books of interest to you right now. One is co-edited by André Lecourt and myself, and Alan Trench and Michael Keating are authors in this book. It's entitled The Parliaments of Autonomous Nations, and it is a comparative study of the role of parliaments in the search towards greater political liberty and protection of identity, and it will be published by McGill Queen's next April. And the second book is part of the Global Dialogue series of the Forum of Federations. It's been very long in preparation, but finally will be out by Oxford University Press this fall, and it's co-edited by Cheryl Saunders from Australia and Joanne Poirier, and it is a comparative study of intergovernmental relations in federal regimes. So Parliament of Autonomous Nations and comparative study of intergovernmental relations may be helpful to a number of you. I wish I had a theory of constitutional generosity. I don't. I've been thinking about that in a variety of ways for 20 years. After the second Quebec referendum in 1995, we brought people in Montreal with the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and we prepared an edited book entitled Beyond the Impasse. And in my book, I argued that in constitutional discussions and dialogue with partners with whom you share a polity, you don't have to be naked in front of the other. You don't have to want the other to be naked in terms of interests and things like that. But it is useful and morally very important to put yourself in the shoes of the other. Bona fide, the other partners, be they provinces, other nations, various sorts of groups, have a vision of their own community, of the whole, and of their future. And you must have empathy for that. You must understand that in order to be able to enter into a meaningful constitutional dialogue. Now there are many ways to do that, and I'm absolutely not against brokerage politics, elite politics, negotiations and stuff like that by self-interested people. That's fine, but the moral dimension, it seems to me, is very important. It entails, for instance, at times, giving greater focus to what you believe you can do with the others in the future than to insisting about mostly, let's say, what the negative things they've done to you in the past. Now, as Michael said, the past is mightily relevant in a variety of places. Let's say we share a polity. Your history, even if different from mine, even if your historiography has substantial differences, if it's about the same polity over many centuries, that's more meaningful for me than Fernand Braudel's History of France, although I may really like Braudel as a historian, and I may believe it's way better than either you and I. But the history is recounting, it's not my history, the way yours, with your differences, is mine. So in the past years, what we've attempted to do is bring together, not in an attempt to come up with one interpretation of Canadian constitutional history, but we've brought together, again in a project with Eugénie Brouillet and Alain Gagnon, we've tried to bring together historians of both French-speaking and English-speaking Canada, dead and living historians, and so we've made available to a wider public their constitutional interpretations. And that, to me, is part of the preconditions of a dialogue by representative politicians that would be characterized by a political theory or hermeneutics of generosity. But for today, I'm afraid I can't go much further than that.
Okay, oh gosh, I've got, right, you had a question before, but your hand is now down. Would you like to ask a question? Why don't we take them in a round and then we'll return to the, yeah.
The issue of the exemption of Quebec on immigration was mentioned a couple of times, and one understands that the intention of the Quebecois government was to strengthen the Francophone project. But I understand that actually most of these migrants are not too supportive of the idea of Quebec's separatism. And I wonder if there's a general point that could be taken from this, that migrants on the whole prefer larger polities.
I'll take a couple of questions. You had a question up here, hang on.
My name is Anne Kubricks. I'm from Nigeria. I want to make an observation very quickly and then perhaps prefer from a point of view some solution. Now, we're here because of constitutional change and the challenges that come along with the desire for those constitutional changes around devolution and federalism. Now, the constitution that every country has right now has come about for whatever those purposes are to suit those countries at those particular times. Now, I also want to observe that the challenges that is coming from wanting to change those constitutions to suit these countries in today's world, the challenges we face, therefore, in the area of devolution and federalism, I think those are coming from the voices of people that may have felt left out or do feel left out from the Constitution that we are seeking the changes in. And I want to prefer or say that if we want to face these challenges, overcome these challenges, and actually move ahead and have a change in these constitutions, then I believe that we need to listen primarily to the people that have issues with the Constitution that we are looking to change. That is where the issues of rights come in. And this is where we need to listen to when we say, like in Canada, when we talk of the Aborigines in Canada, when we talk even in Nigeria, where I come from, we now are looking at issues of resources and issues of rights, of how these resources are shared and how these resources are infused into health programs and things where people may feel left out or may not feel left out, and where corruption is an issue. So if we don't address this, then become fundamental problems within the constitutions. And if we don't address these fundamental issues, whether they are based on morals of what people may think were done to them even 100 years ago, in the case of Nigeria, when the country was brought together in 1914 as a nation, without the various ethnic groups that make up this country being consulted. The British colonial government just decided to put the northern people and the southern people together that have different religion and different languages and different cultures. And now whatever you're hearing about Nigeria today is based on those lack of consultation. And here we are today, 100 years on, in 21st century, where we have this type of technological development. We have terrorism that people can sit in their homes and blow up hundreds of people at a time. Now, we need to address these, I think, we need to address these fundamental moral and even people who feel that they've been had done by. And I feel that if we address these issues in the constitution that we want to change, by carrying these feelings on board and seeing how we can change and accommodate the people like us so that the whole world can move forward. If we don't do that, then I think that differently at different times, we would have these issues. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got two more quick questions, and then we'll end that there. So, Francois, did you have a question?
Just listening to the exchange with Jim and two of you, two quick questions. Should generosity be an inverse function of the weight of the parties? So the larger the majority, the more generous you should be, or the other way? So it be inverse or direct function? So do you crush or do you accommodate? But listening to Guy's answer, I just want to ask him just a thought that comes and you think about it. You almost describe a truth and reconciliation process. Is that the way forward for constitutional negotiations starting in 2017, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada? I don't know.
Stephen, last question.
Thank you. Yeah, it was but the international dimension, it was coming out of Francois' presentation. Actually, the first point was the notion that NAFTA membership, to some extent, was an unpopular thing in Quebec and was potentially secession-inducing compared to EU membership, which has the opposite effect. I mean, I assume that this is to Guy, the reasoning behind that is largely linguistic, that Quebec finds itself in an even larger Anglophone hegemon, but I'd be interested to hear your reflection on that. But for Michael, it's the other point that came out of Francois' paper, which was the notion that provinces in Canada, to some extent, have greater fiscal freedom than member states of the European Union, and increasingly the case. And to tie that into your notion of the symbolism of nationalism, because during the independence debate, the whole issue around Europe was, would Scotland get in and how? And it was never, should it apply to join? And there was never any real debate about whether Scotland would be better off trying to get the kind of fiscal independence within the UK that provinces have in Canada. And I think Richard Simeon used to make at this point that Quebec, English nationalists in Canada would accept any degree of decentralization to Quebec if they never had to surrender the symbolism of national recognition. And Quebec nationalists would accept any degree of centralization provided they were recognized as a nation. And I wonder if there's something in that when we think about the Scottish membership of the EU debate.
Okay, so we've got questions on immigration and what immigrants prefer in terms of their constitutional vision. We have questions on constitutional adaptation and listening to outsiders. We've got a point about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and whether one is required in Canada, and then an international dimension and the notion of fiscal freedom. Who wants to go first?
Can I?
Of course.
I'll go quick with the first two and a bit longer with the third. No, Stephen, the United States, I thought for defenders of the Quebec National Project, imagining the United States, let's say they were in favor of NAFTA and then a North American Free Trade Agreement for a variety of reasons, including greater liberty from English-speaking Canada. That was the rationale. But in contra, I'd quote one of our essayists, Pierre Vadeboncoeur, and I hear him very generous because he really didn't like me. But he's now dead, so we cannot continue the conversation. But I'll quote him. These guys, these people don't even know that we exist. The United States vis-a-vis Quebec. So, don't put your faith in that kind of hegemon. And so the significant others for us in terms of political community and doing things together in the future, whatever the Constitution, is, of course, the rest of Canada and English-speaking Canadians, and certainly not the United States. That's my answer for that. Truth and reconciliation, although I'm part of that intellectual family called Canadian or Quebec idealists, unless some of the idealists, a couple of them were mentioned here today, unless some of them, I'm also a realist, a constitutional realist. So in 2015, the probability, how are these things going to be done, if there is ever something beyond constitutional paralysis in Canada, contrary to the late 1980s, it will probably be an attempt by other players but Quebec to want to change something within the Canadian constitutional order, be it the Senate or further Aboriginal recognition and things like that. My point is simply that if that occurs, combining idealism and realism, Quebec authorities should be prepared with a realistic understanding of what they can demand, what they really need for the Quebec national project in the 21st century, and be, on the whole, more realistic than, let's say, their predecessors of 30 years ago. So that would be my answer for today. Immigration, the short answer, you have here Keith Banting and his colleague Will Kimlicka. Read their works because they're way better than mine on this issue. My take would be something like this. Immigrants come to Canada. So the Canadian National Project is their first, it's their first encounter. It is to this country that they come, and it is the integrative capacities of Canadian citizenship that are first and foremost important for them. And we're not going to change that. At the same time, in Canada, immigration is dealt with simultaneously by the central government and the provinces. And for us, it is a relevant issue for both the Canadian and the Quebec national projects. Each has developed its own integrative model. Each uses, on the whole, utilitarian criteria to select immigrants very coldly with a system of points. And if you're 30 years younger than I am, and if you speak 4 languages more than I am, and if you have £500,000 more than I am, frankly, my dear, you'll get more points either in Quebec or anywhere else in Canada. So it's a very instrumental approach. And refugees occupy, Keith will correct me if need be, but a very limited number of the whole immigration scheme in Canada. So both national projects are relevant, but for immigrants, as far as we can say in Canada, undeniably, they have preferred the national project of the country that receives them, and that country is called Canada.
Okay, Michael, you've got the last word for today.
Yes, the question about the people being left out of the Constitution, I think this is absolutely critical. Very often constitutional debates are too far removed from the circumstances that people are facing, and we have our sophisticated intellectual concepts and are not addressing issues. And that's why I kept on emphasizing, and what we're trying to do is saying, what is the Constitutional doing about the rescaling of welfare, the fiscal crisis, all kinds of substantive issues. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time unless it addresses people's everyday conditions. Francois, the generosity on the side, that part of the larger party, I think something is that. Yeah. Well, Jim Gallagher, who is more than capable of talking for himself, wrote something recently which was really quite interesting. He's saying, well, of course, in this constitutional conversation, England must be recognized as a partner. You can't pretend that they're not there. On the other hand, maybe the smaller parties are more vulnerable. There might need to be some special recognition, and the English are more capable of looking after themselves. I've got it right, Jim. That seems to be more or less the argument. I think that's a useful thing to think about, because there are asymmetries of power and welfare that have constitutional implications. And as for Stephen, I've always thought that the referendum debate last year was all about renegotiating different forms of union. We built that into our project. We said, whatever happens, we're going to get different forms of union. And then we had Alex Salmon very helpfully confirming that by saying we're in 6 unions, and we're only going to get out of 1. And the European Union, since the late 80s, has become a fundamental framework for the Scottish independence project because it provides an external support system, as NAFTA does, but European Union goes much further because it's not just economics, it's a single market and protection against unilateral action, all kinds of things. But what we didn't really hear was these debates being linked up. So, okay, we'll go into Europe, but what kind of Europe do we want? An intergovernmental Europe, a more social Europe? That debate never occurred. Or the kind of argument, well, of course we'll accept limitations on our sovereignty, what will we get in turn? I think that's the real argument, negotiating all these unions within which we're embedded. Maybe that will come back again when the European referendum comes around, because for sure that will be debated in a different frame within Scotland.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a final announcement. If you finished, it concerns you. Because tomorrow morning, Stephen and Ailsa are presenting. They're not just research partners, but they're a household, and they have 3 children who have to be dropped off. And anyway, we realise it's pretty punishing to start at 9 o'clock for those of you who come across the Atlantic. Never mind people like me who just live 200 metres away. So we propose to start at 9:15 tomorrow. That's generosity. That is really generosity.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can thank us for that, and we'll squeeze that a bit. We still have to finish at the same time.
One of the things about becoming a lecturer, obviously, is that you're no longer listening to lectures as often as you once were. You're the one writing them, and you realize when you have to be the one writing them that you've lost how wonderful it is to sit in an audience and just listen to people tell you things that you didn't know before. And I often look at the incoming cohort of students in Edinburgh and wonder, do they have any idea how lucky they are to take courses from the different colleagues that you have? But I think we've seen a bit of that today. The presentations have been empirically very rich, they've been provocative, the questions have been stimulating, and so I thought that it would be useful for us to thank the 2 speakers for the last session, but also all the speakers today. So thank you very much.